Good afternoon. I feel extremely glad to welcome everyone to this public lecture. Honorable Chairperson for KCHR, Professor K.N. Ganesh, Honorable Director, Professor Dineshan, respected Speaker, Dr. Rajesh KP, distinguished scholars, and my colleagues. Today, we have a fruitful academic session by Dr. Rajesh KP on the topic Conceptual Landscape of Marginality and Adivasis, Surpassing Subaltern Studies. Dr. Rajesh KP works with the Maharashtra National Law University, Nagpur, as an assistant professor of sociology and additionally holds charge of the Center for Tribal and Land Rights. His research interests include the sociology of social movements and development, post-colonial political sociology, civil and political society, Adivasis and modernity in Kerala, indigeneity and indigenous peoples' rights, law and development, citizenship, and social justice. His recent publications are Theorizing Marginality, Discourses on the Making of Modern Adivasi Communities in Kerala, the Anti-Coca-Cola Movement, and Social Movement Studies in India within and beyond sociology, constructing post-colonial political sociology as an evolving framework. After the completion of the event, I am sure that you all will feel enriched with knowledge on this particular topic. After the session, we will have a question and answer session. The questions can be typed in the chat box and we will read them out for the convenience of the speaker. If you still have any concerns about typing, you can ask the questions directly. For this purpose, you just click on the raise hand option. We will read your name accordingly. I feel honored to welcome you all once again for this webinar. I request Professor Dineshan Vadakini to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fascia. Thank you once again, KP Rajesh, for accepting our invitation and agreeing to deliver the lecture. Without further introduction, I request KP Rajesh to proceed with this lecture. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. So shall I start?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I'm extremely happy and grateful to KCHR for giving me this opportunity. And particularly, I must thank Dr. Dineshan Vadakini, Director of KCHR, since I think that he has some familiarity with my work. Since the period I was doing my PhD. Also, I would like to thank Mr. Gautam Das, I think who was the former academic coordinator of KCHR, and he was pursuing me like anything to do this presentation because of a couple of times I was thinking that, I would like to skip the presentation. Or I would want to postpone the presentation. Keep on postponing the presentation. But definitely was pursuing like anything to make this presentation. I'm not sure that's whether he's attending the session or not. Also, the participants, including professors, faculty members, some of my friends, I hope they are there, and also some of my students who are also attending this presentation. I am extending my gratefulness to all the people who are attending the session. So this presentation mainly focuses on the concept of marginality. So I would like to begin this presentation by quoting a passage from Vivek Chibber's book, Postcolonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital. Right? Mostly I'll read out the paper. If it is required, I'll describe some of the portions that is there in the paper, and whenever a clarification is required, probably I'll do that. Otherwise, mostly I'll read out the paper within the time that is allotted to me. I would like to quote from Vivek Chibber's Postcolonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital, where he was saying, while he was making an attempt to problematize subaltern studies, Vivek Chibber writes, by the early 1990s, the traversal to a broadly postmodernist sensibility was more or less complete, while the annual volumes still published essays continuing the call for history from below. There was now an increasing preoccupation with textual analysis with marginality rather than exploitation or domination as an axial concept, with the critique of grand narratives and so on. In order to validate this argument, Chibber cites two important books in the footnote. One is Bonded Histories, Genealogies of Labor, Servitude in Colonial India by Gyan Prakash. And the second one is Hybrid Histories and Wildness in Western India by Ajay Skaria. Right? On the other hand, Gopal Guru, in his relatively a lighter piece titled as Dalits from Margin to Margin, that was published in the year 2000, asserted with a positive connotation that, I quote, in the contemporary imagination, one finds repeated discussions on the issues of social exclusion and marginalization of disadvantaged groups. This discourse on marginalization has replaced earlier terms like exploitation, domination, and suppression. As a reaction to exclusion and marginalization, attempts are made to float counter terms like entitlement, empowerment, and social inclusion. In certain cases, marginalization has been used interchangeably by some scholars. In view of this varied notion of marginalization, it becomes necessary to define the term, particularly in the context of Dalits in India, unquote. Although he made an attempt to offer conceptual meanings to varied notions of marginalization, mostly in a descriptive sense, I would think that he fails to deepen the conceptual meaning in this particular context, right? Given this context, the issue that I confront is what is my motive when I talk about marginality? Whether this is an effort to replace exploitation and domination, the way, Vivek Chibber was criticizing, post-colonial studies, post-colonial theory in general, and specifically in subaltern studies. Right, the way both Chibber and Gopal Guru argues, however, from different and often contradictory vantage points, theoretical vantage points, indeed, the purpose of this presentation is not to outrightly reject the concept of exploitation and domination. Rather, I find the inadequacy of these concepts while studying Adivasi politics and land question in contemporary Kerala. This is not merely highlighting the deficiency of these concepts, but the movement activism of Adivasis, complicating the meaning of marginality, and these meanings are emanated through their social movement discourses. Therefore, the major aim of this presentation is to unravel those meanings and ensuring towards a more conceptual inclination in relation to marginality. In other words, the pertinent question that animates this inquiry is whether marginality can be considered as a theoretical concept that is part of a wider theory of justice. State interventions in the domain of Adivasi life in post-colonial India, since Nehruvian developmentalism in the 1950s were framed mainly through the discourse of marginality. Consequently, a dominant discourse was constructed around the idea of development and the modernization of Adivasis. Similarly, the Kerala state's official discourse about Adivasi life, one that attributes to them the status of being marginal, concerning the mainstream, is associated with their alleged economic and educational backwardness, primitive agricultural practices, the lack of infrastructural and institutional facilities such as roads, transportation, health centers, schools in Adivasi areas, poverty, their perceived ignorance, and alcoholism. In my view, one of the fundamental presuppositions imagined in these notions is that marginality has been constituted naturally against their disinclination to become modern. Therefore, the purpose of encapsulating this particular strand dealing with the state's position here is not to reduce this into a simple binary between the state on the one hand and Adivasis on the other, but to situate them in a complex relationship. Thus, the attempt here is not to deny that the state's discourse on Adivasis emerges from a network of heterogeneously placed institutions, and these institutions are sometimes in conflict with each other. However, careful critical scrutiny of these discourses unravels an underlying common disposition on marginality. This translates into a hegemonic notion in the state's developmental discourse around Adivasi communities in Kerala. Various academic studies published during the last 2 decades systematically unfolded the complexities entangled in the relationship between Adivasis and the state institutions, particularly in the post-colonial period. Foregrounded on these theoretical and empirical insights offered by various studies, this presentation attempts to explicate and expand the meaning of the category marginality. So I interrogate the notion of marginality as constructed and used by the state and its various apparatus to argue that it does not adequately capture the complexity of the condition and experiences of the lived marginality of Adivasis. Later I'm referring to some of the discourses of the state and how that discourses, which is giving a very simplified and flimsy understanding of marginality that I'll discuss later. Probably in this in this presentation, so I critically engage with the promulgated discourses of marginality, land and communitarian identity within and by a contemporary social movement, that is Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha. Therefore, this when we look at the sociological meanings of marginality, marginality was discussed both as an empirical and conceptual category, but mostly marginality was discussed as an empirical category in the context of sociology. Therefore, the various meanings associated with marginality, in relation to different disciplines in social science, but predominantly my orientation would be referring to sociology and anthropology, and to some extent post-colonial studies as well. So terms like marginality, marginal, margin, and marginalization, these are all connected terms, have been widely used in sociological and anthropological accounts, mainly as descriptive categories rather than analytical concepts. Consequently, marginality has been accepted and used as a given category in many studies without deepening its conceptual meanings, particularly when it connects with the marginalized sections in society like Adivasis and Dalits, particularly Adivasis. So this is not an attempt to denigrate the contributions of existing studies in conceptualizing the Adivasi land question and their indigenous identity, but instead to perceive certain categories that demand further conceptual elaboration. And I recognize that marginality is one such category, and further a modest, and I think that marginality is definitely one of such categories. And this is a modest effort to expand the conceptual meanings of the term marginality beyond its descriptive usage. When we look at the meaning of marginality, definitely the contribution of Subaltern Studies project that was inaugurated in the year 1980, which is so important, right? So subaltern studies made a significant effort to conceptualize how, elites' hegemonic historical and political process systematically marginalize the subaltern classes of Indian society and their politics. These intellectual attempts looked at marginality as part of subalternity, as part of subalternity, and their conceptualizations revolve mainly around the concept of subaltern. So if I look at Alf Gunvald Nilsson's work, Alf Gunvald Nilsson and Roy meticulously summarize the trajectory of this term and its changing meaning over time, and presented the limitations of this concept used by the subaltern scholars. This is where I would like to situate the notion of marginality and made an attempt to go beyond, right, how marginality was actually situated in the context of subaltern studies, right? So as we know that, see, Ranajit Guha, when he was talking about, when he was, writing the introduction and preface and introduction to the series of subaltern studies, he was always looking at subaltern studies or subaltern politics, which is always considered and constituted as an autonomous domain that is different and distant from the realm of elite politics, right? As we know that, see, Guha put forward this kind of an argument as part of an attempt to reinstate the agency of subaltern denied by colonial as well as elite historiography. On the contrary, when we look at Alf Gunvald Nilsson and Roy, they largely rejected the idea of a pure and autonomous domain of subaltern politics. And subalternity has been explicated in their study through, three axes of relational, intersectional, and dynamic aspects, right? So based on these discussion, indeed, the condition of marginality primarily implies a spatial connotation that is expressed through the term margin. Thus, a margin is often conceived concerning the sender within the frontiers of a hierarchical spatial organization. This understanding attends to the position of the margin from the global level of international relation to the local level of an internal structure of a given country's region or other smaller territorial unit. This is one of the ways in which probably marginality was conceptualized, right? While analyzing the relationship between geographic uplands and the lowlands in terms of marginality in the context of indigenous people and the state in Indonesia, Mureli suggests, one of the prominent anthropologists, Mureli suggests three consequent implications of this kind of an understanding. The first one was uplands and lowlands are brought within a single analytical frame and treated as one integrated system. And as per this view, margins are an essential part of the whole, not separate, complete objects of study in themselves. Secondly, marginality is clearly a relational concept involving a social construction, not merely a natural one. Finally, there is an obvious asymmetry between margin and the center. The two do not stand in a relationship of two equals, part of an encompassing all. But at the same time, Mureli has observed that the question of marginality is always an empirical one. It has to do with hegemonic claims and their local resonances, refractions, and outcomes. However, my attempt is not merely to locate the idea of marginality at the empirical level, but to expand the conceptual meanings of marginality based on empirical instances and experiences. So that is where, I'm taking the example of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha as an empirical context, as well as a social movement activism in order to talk about marginality, or what is exactly the way in which marginality in fact emanates through the internal descriptions and discourses of the movement. So therefore, when we discussed about marginality in this context, right? It is important to locate the constitution of marginality of the Adivasis in Kerala in the specific socio-economic and political processes associated with developmental discourses, practices, institutional engagements, and ideology since the formation of the modern state in Kerala. Thus, this paper considers marginality as a continuing and conflicting relationship with power attached to these discourses, practices, and institutions. Besides, marginality implies misrecognition or non-recognition and entails multiple forms of subordination, oppression, and exploitation. From this perspective, I envisage marginality as constituted through multiple dimensions, which can be understood spatial, economic, social, and cultural, that I'll explain a little later. So now, based on these discussion, if we go to the social movement Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, I'm so sure that see many of the people who are listening to me will have an understanding, definitely will have an understanding about the genesis of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha in Kerala. Some of them definitely, I mean, who are not much familiar with the context of Kerala, who are listening to me, probably they need a little understanding, I mean, a little explanation that is required about the genesis of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha in Kerala. So I'm not going to a lot of details about the historical origin of this movement and its evolution. I'm giving a very brief, historical context about the origin of this movement. Probably the rest we can do when we are interacting with each other. So this Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha as a social movement emerged as a result of the consolidation of various agitations, primarily demanding land that occurred mainly in the Wayanad district of Kerala since the early 1990s under the leadership of C.K. Janu, who belonged to one of the most marginalized sections of the Adivasi known as Adiya community. In 2001, several Adivasis in Kerala were reported to have died due to poverty and starvation. The mainstream newspapers reported that around 32 Adivasis had died in Adivasi majority areas of the state during May, June, and July in 2001. The state's official accounts stated that the crucial factors for the starvation deaths of the Adivasis were polluted water, deficiency in nutritious food, high levels of alcohol consumption, and an unhygienic lifestyle. So this posed a serious challenge to the widely acclaimed idea of Kerala model of development or uniqueness of the Kerala development experience and created a deep discontent among the Adivasis with the Kerala state. So before getting into that history, right, this kind of an understanding or this kind of a discourse of the state, which I narrated, right, the official account of the state, listing out the reasons of the starvation death of Adivasis. We need to have an analysis of that official discourse. This is what I started. When I started the presentation, I was talking about what is exactly the way in which an official discourse which is creating a particular notion about marginality in relation to Adivasis. So similarly, if you look at the state's official account, so that I described, the discourse on marginality, you can find that this discourse definitely is creating a particular notion of marginality, in which what is hygienic and unhygienic definitely needed a separate discussion, which I'm not taking as part of this presentation. But at the same time, the other factors, such as polluted water, deficiency of nutritious food, and excessive alcohol consumption, of course, many of these things are a reality. I would agree with that. See, these are a reality. which is existing in many parts, which I encountered when I went for field work. But at the same time, how this is resulted through a historical process which is largely absent in the official discourses. State at the macro and local level and the notion and practice of development played a pivotal role in creating this condition, but that is absent in the discourse on marginality by the various state institutions, and this is one of the examples. Instead, the state's discourse construct an idea of Adivasi as outliers having specific features in the context of contemporaneity, but the later, that means the contemporaneity, which is removed and disconnected from the history of subordination and oppression. Sorry. Thus, the state's discourses on marginality becomes flimsy, oversimplified, problematic, and unscholarly description of marginality, lacking a complex understanding of power relations, its asymmetry, and historical conception of marginality. Here, state also construct an everyday social of the Adivasis in Kerala. This everyday social is detached from the historical transformative process. Thus, this is an example of how does marginality arise through the discourse of the state, and finally a range of studies show that so based on this, we could say that when we are talking about communities, communities described as tribes. So this is, I'm taking this point from Alpasha's book on indigeneity, where she was talking about, communities described as tribes cannot be defined independently of the state systems with which they are associated. So that's why, when we look at this kind of a discourse, we would say that is how the official account of the state, which I have already, discussed, the way state is actually constructing the notion of marginality. This is actually the context in which, this is the context in which Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, as a social movement, as a mobilization of Adivasis was originated. So this is the context, one could say, that all the ad hoc measures taken by the state to address the deprivation of Adivasis, right, which is a symptomatic of the state's ability to situate marginality of the Adivasis within the more extensive process of socio-political and historical transformation of Kerala, right? So this is the context in which probably C.K. Janu, the leader of the movement, questioned the temporary measures taken by the government to prevent the starvation deaths that was happening among the Adivasis at that point. So along with Janu, many other Adivasis and Dalit leaders demanded an enduring solution to the deprivation of the Adivasis in Kerala. What we could see is that, a lot of description which is there, which I'm skipping. So this was definitely, this movement was a unique and distinct type of Adivasi agitation. Their initial struggle, in fact, continued for almost 48 days and attracted wide public attention in Kerala. So some of the major demands of this agitation that can be outlined as: number one, 5 acres of land for each landless Adivasi family to prevent starvation and poverty. Withdrawal of the petition filed in the Supreme Court against Nallathambi Thera's public interest litigation. And third one, incorporation of Adivasi land in the 5th schedule of the Constitution of India, right? Another important leader of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, Mr. M. Geethanandan, he was the leader of AGMS. And when I interviewed him, he explained the reasons for the third demand right? That was, I mean, incorporating that as part of the 5th schedule of the Constitution of India. If the Adivasi inhabited area is included in the 5th schedule based on Article 244 of the Indian Constitution, it will get constitutional protection and also come under the jurisdiction of the state's governor. It would protect the forest and Adivasi rights better than the present condition, and it may preserve the biodiversity and bioresources. However, the Adivasi inhabited region in Kerala is not yet included in the 5th schedule of the Constitution. I mean, that was the narration he was given when I interviewed him. I mean, now the interview was happened as part of my PhD. That was during 2010-11 period. Now the data is a little old one. So this narration shows a discrepancy between the constitutional measures and the substantive reality of Adivasi life in Kerala. It also signifies the difference in the stances of judiciary and the legislature on the Adivasi. Sometimes you'll find that there are two distinct positions, which is always not true. That is, judiciary definitely is taking one position, which is, I would say, relatively supporting the cause of Adivasis, but not all the time, right? But state, definitely the legislature, which is moving in a very different direction, contradictory to that position. But my purpose definitely is not to say that all the judicial decisions were all the time supporting the demands of the Adivasis in Kerala. Now, when I look at how, C.K. Janu was looking at this movement, at a later point, right? In 2022, when I interviewed her, right, by the time we could say that Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, almost reached in a very saturated stage, where the initial enthusiasm of the movement, or the momentum that they maintained for some time, was not existing at that point. And also there was a strong disagreement that happened between Janu and Gitanandan, which we could see, which again culminated into various decisions of these people, especially Janu's, association with BJP, etc., which I'm not getting into at this moment. But in 2002, Janu was making a reflection on some of these things. Also, the long trajectory of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, where Janu was saying that is, as you know, that AGMS mainly focused on the agitations for land. The significance of each agitation that we initiated has been discussed only at the moment and negotiated with the government while the agitation was actively going on. In my experience in the moment, Janu says, I could say that Adivasis can be mobilized at any moment under the banner of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha. But as far as mine is concerned, the main question are whether the demands put forward by the movement has been accomplished at the practical level and how far the Adivasis are getting benefit out of that. To attain this, she was making a point that is political representation and intervention which is necessary. Beyond the initiation of protest and submitting memorandums, AGMS may not be able to do many political interventions. That was the point which she was making by referring to the beginning stage. Eventually, the government decides everything. Thus, the issue cannot be resolved forever unless we get political power. This is the position. So under the current circumstances, getting political power in Kerala without the support of mainstream political alliances is unthinkable. This is actually the point in which she was making a deviation, a clear deviation from the position which Gitanandan was taking. Now, coming back to the movement and how this is actually constructing the notion of marginality, that is important in the context of this presentation. So the history of AGMS tells us that this movement played a decisive role in raising the Adivasi land question concerning their marginality, especially concerning their marginality. Thus, an inquiry into the marginality of the Adivasis leads to the question, how and in what forms do development and mainstream politics over land create contemporary forms of marginality? I will try to address this question by Exploring the intricate connection between land and marginality. Here it is again worth mentioning Janu's narration about Adivasi marginality that was already published um, in an interview that was published in Countercurrents, and more or less the same thing which she, talked to me when I met her in 2007, 2008 period as part of my fieldwork. She was saying that Adivasis are the real owners of land. Our land was snatched away from us. None of the political parties which came to power in the state took any serious initiative to return the land to the real owners. So Adivasis and Dalits were nowhere in the picture of the policies of the government. So we are always neglected even within the last 4 months. I mean, that was talking from December 2004 to March 2005. I mean, that was actually the period in which Adivasis were died. I mean, 4 Adivasis were died in different parts of Thiruvananthapuram district. And there was no land to bury their body as per our tradition. So in 2 such incidents, the bodies have been buried in the kitchen of their hutmans themselves. On another occasion, we buried the body of an Adivasi in another one's land. Now, I mean, if I look at another, there are a lot of narrations which is there in the published paper, right? So I'm not reading out every single narration that is there in the published paper. But based on these narrations that I collected through my field work, all these narratives enunciate that Adivasi's miserable condition and articulates various dimensions of their marginality in contemporary Kerala. At this point, Janu's perception of real ownership attempts to historicize the Adivasi land issue and reinforces the claim that forest dwellers enjoyed customary rights in the forest, particularly in the pre-colonial period onwards. There is a long history that was discussed. So again, I'm not getting into a detailed discussion about the historical part due to the paucity of time. Probably let me come to the discussion, right, about the meanings of land and how the meanings of land that is connected to an understanding of capitalist modernity versus a distinct modern imagination, and how that is actually revisiting the idea of marginality. So the modern idea of land ownership, mainly introduced since the beginning of British rule, conceived the meaning of land in a manner that had not existed in the past. Contrary to the customary and communitarian notion of land ownership that I explained, the modern capitalist idea of land ownership comprises notions such as private land, land as an economic resource, and legal property rights. These notions appear in direct conflict with Janu's narration. And here, the real owners when we are talking about. And here, the intention is not to say that she is carrying a traditional notion of land by recreating a traditional modern binary. Rather, I argue that her notion of land as an Adivasi leader carries a distinct modern imagination that challenges the capitalist modernist perspective on land. Further, Gidanandan's observation stated that is also discussed, that narration was there, which I'll read out later if that is required as part of our discussion, right? So the modern distinct imagination which Gidanandan was talking about, where there is a conscious efforts of the AGMS, Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, to articulate this distinct modern imagination of land. Therefore, an argument can be drawn from the movement discourses that they recognize the importance of moving from customary rights on land predominantly attached to a pre-modern society to a unique modern understanding of land to find an enduring solution to the marginality of Adivasis. This argument I mean, this argument can be strengthened by looking at the various substantive articulations of the movement. Now, when we look at the primary claim that one of the primary claims of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, right? One of the primary claims of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha was considering land as resources, which is a modern claim wherein the production on land is envisaged as a resource for the survival of the Adivasi communities in Kerala. Interestingly, land is also primarily conceived as an economic category to ensure cultivation and a sustainable livelihood. Unlike the traditional practices of shifting cultivation and gathering forest products, the Adivasi now want settled agriculture by acquiring 5 acres of land. This imagination of an agrarian economy gives prime importance to cultivating various crops and their cultivation as well as its marketing. I mean, to some extent, with a different understanding of subsistence and survival, resist a market-driven capitalist agrarian production, which does not recognize social and cultural value of land as a resource. So this, I would like to view this as a counter discourse by AGMS against the dominant discourse emphasizing resource exploitation. Therefore, the term, Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha is using another term, that is power over, land as a resource as well as power over resources. And this power over resources, which is again envisaging a community's modern rights by establishing culturally, economically, and politically legitimate control over land and natural resources. Hence, the demand for 5 acres of land for each Adivasi encompasses an attempt to negotiate with the existing power and authority, primarily determined by the idea of private ownership of land overlooking the existence of, private ownership of land overlooking the existence of community. Again, the backdrop of this discussion, it can be seen that the agitation for 5 acres of land was more of a political battle to challenge the marginality of Adivasis. Therefore, I would like to reiterate a point or an argument that I made already, that is the invocations, land as a resource and power over land, through which, these are the articulations through which AGMS asserting a distinct modern imagination of Adivasi community by interrogating the structures of marginality. So this is where, we have to move on to the conceptual understanding of marginality, where I would like to say that, this is talking about multiple marginality. So the extraction of resources by the state, other dominant communities and global capital, in fact, resulted the alienation of Adivasis from land and forest in various historical phases, right? That is already discussed in a number of works. So this is an economic process that has resulted in the spatial, social, economic, and cultural marginality of Adivasis. The spatial marginality indicates the displacement process, both coercive and non-coercive, of the Adivasis from their forest and cultivated land. They were forced to settle in colonies constructed by the state in post-colonial period, which is also an indication of spatial segregation and spatial marginality. Similarly, when we talk about social marginality, which is referring to the exclusion of Adivasis from the social life of mainstream society. They are always located at the periphery, either in colonies or in remote areas of forest. In this manner, their social location is permanently configured in the dominant discourses as inferior to mainstream society. Similarly, their cultural marginality cannot be disconnected from these two dimensions, which was spatial marginality as well as the social marginality that I described. The cultural margin, therefore, cultural marginality is always tied up with the question of identity. When the government failed to keep its promises to the AGMS, many Adivasis and their families occupied Muttanga Wildlife Sanctuary in January 2003. They entered the sanctuary asserting that the forest should be handed over to its real owners, right? Which is again an attempt to problematize cultural marginality of CK Janu. Um, uh, so what I'm trying to indicate here is that, see, uh, when we look at the occupation of Muttanga Wildlife Sanctuary by the Adivasis, probably we'll find that uh, they are talking about, we found 6 sacred groves here, I mean, inside the Muttanga forest, and we believe that, see, they might have existed before the declaration of the forest as a wildlife sanctuary. I mean, these kinds of explanations and narrations which you will always find in relation to this. So I mean, similar narratives that I came across throughout my field work, and then in this specific expression, I mean, these kinds of expressions, Janu, as well as the people who are associated with Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, proclaimed a different kind of a relationship with forest land. This proclamation was always predicated on particular notion of sacredness informed by Adivasi tradition and culture. However, it is not an attempt to, I mean, this is also a point which I wanted to emphasize here. However, it is not an attempt to essentialize the meaning of culture and tradition, but rather locate them as part of a larger cultural process. It refers to those social processes related to human meaning, values, identities, and discourses that are definitely occurring throughout society, like the economic process mainly constituted by the production and distribution of goods and services. So it is evident that the Adivasis are definitely experiencing multiple marginalities historically, but their organized political responses are far more complicated when they bring tradition and culture into the realm of resistance. Therefore, it can be presumed that Janu's narration of Adivasi tradition and culture represent a discontent and resistance against the distinction between nature and culture created by the state discourse on forest conservation. The later implies a very static understanding of culture and community, one that left Adivasi culture dissociated from all the socio-economic and political transformations of modernity. This view of an Adivasi culture propagated by state basically constructed an essentialist notion of Adivasi identity. Gradually, it created an asymmetry in power relations, and consequently, Adivasi culture and community were isolated and marginalized from the larger discourses of protection and preservation of forest and wildlife, representing cultural marginality. At the same time, it is also evident that the AGMS has interrogated marginality by propagating a new politics of land by invoking past and tradition deeply rooted in their cultural practices, identity, and community life. Here, the invocation of Adivasi community as a part of movement activism does not, does not exactly match the shibboleth of a pre-given and fixed primordial community. Instead, it demonstrates a conscious mobilization of cultural difference in terms of a community in the making. Similarly, I argue that in the present historical and political context, the identity of the Adivasis is formed through resistance against multiple marginalities. It can be said that the binary between the subordination and resistance of the Adivasis is still a useful framing to understand the category of marginality through the axis of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha. Following Stuart Hall's conceptualization of cultural identity, I argue that discourses of the movement around the idea of community attempt to go beyond the traditional efforts to portray Adivasi identity as confined to an essentialized past characterized by an imperishable and enduring entity. So this is the way I have examined the historical, largely the historical part too, which I could not discuss so much because I thought that if I get into the historical discussion, probably the presentation will take a lot of time. So that is the reason probably my presentation is largely confined into the contemporary context, specifically related to the discourses constructed by Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha. So, see, both historical and contemporary socio-political discourses in the constitution of Adivasi marginality resulting from the mainstream practices of development located in the larger terrain of post-colonial capitalism. So, in this specific case, marginality is inherently connected with land alienation, eviction from the forest, displacement to the interior areas of forest, and denial of access to food gathering and forest resources. So marginality is not merely confined to the domain of economy and culture, but encompasses the connected social and political. This understanding goes beyond the conventional um, division of social, cultural, and economic, political as distinct and mutually exclusive spaces and aspects. Thus, um, my argument is that Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha has made a conscious attempt to combine all these claims, right, which I already explained, which is an attempt to interrogate the idea of marginality, and this interrogation definitely is helping us to uh, expand the meaning of marginality from a descriptive realm to a more conceptual realm. So that's what I made in this presentation. So that was the major effort that I have taken in this presentation. So therefore, when you look at all the major claims of the Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, so there are various ideas. For instance, modern Adivasi agency, I mean identity as well as agency, that has been engaging with the multiple structures of marginality, uh, also in the form of struggle, negotiation with the modern state, and contestations over the question of social justice, as well as equitable distribution of resources. All these things, all these efforts are some sort of a reconciliation of various aspects in the making of a modern Adivasi community, which exemplifies the invocation of a distinct modernity that critically interrogate the structures of marginality, and uh, uh, that effort or that attempt to critically interrogate with the structures of marginality, which is actually leading to construct an expanded conceptual idea of marginality, right? Therefore, I would like to conclude the presentation here by saying that is when I started the presentation, I started with a critique that was presented by Vivek Chibber in his post-colonial theory and the spectre of capital, where he was making an assertion that, see, there is a cultural turn that is happening, which is actually replacing the idea of exploitation and oppression. So in the place of exploitation and oppression, we are actually articulating the idea of marginality, which he was finding very problematic. So what my effort is I mean, by engaging with the discourses of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, is to construct a marginality, to expand the conceptual meaning of the marginality, which I explained already, right? Which is definitely not an attempt to replace exploitation and oppression. But what I'm saying is that, see, the deficiency of understanding the complex relationship that I already described in the presentation, which is actually demanding to expand the meaning of the idea marginality. And this is, of course, a modest effort to do that, right? And that effort definitely we need to continue as part of this exercise. So thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. KP Rajesh, for a wonderful presentation. Wonderful as well as thought-provoking presentation. I hope there will be questions from the participants. I invite questions from the participants. As our academic coordinator already said, you can either type your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand option to ask question directly to the speaker. I hope our chairperson is also attending the webinar. I hope he will also make some comments. And chairperson has already raised his hand. Instead of, I'll come back with my simple questions, but before that, I request chairperson to make comments.
It's in the box. I think there are questions in the box. I'll speak towards the end after the director also speaks. So thank you very much. I'll have a few questions to ask to Rajesh. And hi, Rajesh. I think you know me.
Yes. Definitely.
Let the others ask questions.
Yeah, I think people are right now typing their questions. Before that, once they all came, I'll start reading, or our academic coordinator will start reading such questions. For the time being, I'll ask one simple question, which regarding the concept of marginality itself. So, from marginality to multiple marginality, and the importance of usage of multiple marginality. So what I felt is that whenever we use the word marginality or the concept of marginality, this supposes that there are what we call other things like, say, centrality, mainstream inclusion, sometimes empowerment, and sometimes even dominance. All these words comes in relation of difference with the idea of margin. So there are many things like that. And when we say that instead of using the marginality in singularity, and if we are moving to the complexity of marginality and the multiplicity of marginality, we will be able to capture a completely different sense of marginality. I feel that still there is some problem. So marginality always presupposes some kind of relation of difference. The relation of difference, what I already said, centrality or mainstream or something like that. Even if it is, we say that there is multiple marginality, it is not actually get divorced from the central idea of marginality. If that is a situation, whatever may be happening, whatever discourse is emerging inside the marginality or the multiple marginality, everything will be coming in a larger single paradigm called the issue of marginality. So if you want to move away from the idea of marginality or the marginality in relation to marginality as it is developed in relation to the idea of the mainstream of centrality, you must develop a completely different concept. That is what I felt. There required a paradigm shift to give meaning to the real situations in which Adivasis are situated, Adivasis are making their agency out, and things like that. So, for example, see, people like James Scott, even though I am not an admirer of James Scott, they would say that, see, there are people who know state, but they don't want to go with the state. They can have a completely different model of social structure to live. Just like that, instead of going into the complexity of marginality, or even if instead of multiplying it, if there is a way to develop a completely different concept, which will liberate the multiple marginality from the clutches of its somehow relation to the centrality or the mainstream. I think then only there will be some potential when looking from the side of the Adivasi. That is what I felt when you use the concept of multiplicity. I don't know whether I made the point clear.
So you made the point. I mean, definitely one part of that is a comment I can take, whether there is any alternative concept that is possible, which is, if I understand correctly, which is actually breaking this idea of center and margin. That's what you are pointing out, I think. Uh, 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 but what, see, my effort, definitely my effort is that, see, what is exactly the idea of marginality that is emanating through the discourses of the movement. So that was my my predominant occupation in this paper as well as in this study, where when you look at the discourses of the movement, whether the movement is actually providing um, um, any intellectual resource which is actually going beyond this understanding of they are interrogating, definitely they are interrogating marginality. That I mentioned here. That is, while interrogating marginality, right? See, marginality as a concept which is constructed by the discourses of the movement, which is so important to understand this process, right? Probably your suggestion would be definitely, I would say, a kind of a normative suggestion, where we have to think about an alternative concept, right? To break this idea, because, see, whatever the way in which we are talking about marginality, right? See, there is deeply a spatial connotation that is attached with this idea that is talking about center and margin, where we have to definitely go beyond that understanding. That is the suggestion, I think, which you are proposing, right? That again, I mean, my idea would be, we have to, I mean, go back to the movement discourses again and again to think about, right, whether the movement discourses is actually providing any sort of right, an intellectual avenue to think about that, which I have to seriously think about. I mean, I, I haven't thought about. I mean, doesn't mean that it was completely absent, but based on the discourses, definitely I have to go back to the discourses once again and think about that.
So, there is a question by Rajeshwari Pidambaran. Please address different research readings on representation of Adivasis and conceptual landscape of space and place of Adivasis in the context of marginality.
Yeah, different readings on representation of Adivasis.
Shall I read it again?
Yeah, no, I mean,
Please.
I can see.
Okay, you got the idea.
Yeah, I got it. Please address different research readings on representation of Adivasis and conceptual landscape of space and place in the context of marginality. So I would say that, see, the literature on representation of Adivasis, of course, I mean, I don't want to specify a lot of literature, which is mostly talking about the representation of Adivasis, right? Representation of Adivasis through Adivasi mobilizations, Adivasi movements in different parts of the country, right? For instance, if you take one of the important works, like in the early 1990s, when you look at the Adivasi mobilization or movement against Sardar Dam, Sarovar Dam project, where Amitabh Aviskar came up with a very, interesting scholarship, which was published by Oxford University Press, in the belly of the river, right? Adivasi conflicts over development, which is definitely talking about the representation of Adivasis. Similarly, a relatively recent work by Alpasha, which is talking about In the Shadow of the State, which is a work on Jharkhand, right? So what I'm saying is that, see, and if you look at Adivasis and the state, specifically in the western region of India, by Alf Ganwal Nilsson, that was published by Cambridge University Press. I mean, you'll find a number of works, right, related to the representation of Adivasi. So there is no dearth of work related to the representation. I mean, if I'm talking about the scholarship. But the second part of the question, which is really important for me, that is, I would say, the conceptual landscape of space and place of Adivasi in the context of marginality, right? See, this is where I started my presentation. If you look at how the space, which is conceived by the state on the one hand, which is conceived by the movement on the other hand. So that is where I started the presentation. That is, if you look at the space in relation to marginality, right? The state discourses around marginality, which is always constructing a inferior imagination about the space which they are talking about. For instance, I mean, how the state was actually looking at the death of Adivasis, right? That is where we started the presentation, right? But on the other hand, when you look at the movement discourses is trying to interrogate this idea of spatial marginality. That is one of the aspects that I discussed in the presentation. The spatial marginality. So the idea of the spatial marginality, where the space is, as I said, is that, see, the space is always constructed as a marginal space, where the marginal space, that is where, see, for instance, I mentioned, that is, see, in the title of my presentation, I mentioned the point, Surpassing Subaltern Studies, which is not merely my effort. I mean, there are various other efforts also, looking at the marginal space, right? I mean, completely devoid of the state intervention, which is actually a problematic understanding. See, that is why, see, for instance, when we are talking about a pure politics, right, or completely autonomous space, right, which I don't agree with. I mean, which I don't agree with that art. I mean, that idea largely. Also, you can find that is not the idea which movement is also talking about. When we talk about the space, right? The space is always mediated through the intervention of the state, right? Probably that is one of the reasons that is the spatial marginality was constructed. And Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha definitely made a lot of effort, in fact, to challenge this idea of a spatial marginality by constructing a new imagination about land. A new imagination about land definitely is talking about a new imagination about space as well, right? And that spatial imagination is making an effort to challenge the hierarchical notion about the spatial imagination that we already constructed through various discourses. So this is what is my understanding by looking at the movement discourses.
She has put forward a suggestion introducing application of induced development among marginal people. Adivasis contradicts with parameters of their cultural life. Please see this in the context of biopolitics also. And no further questions on the chat box.
Now, can I say something now?
Yes,
Please,
sir.
please.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, as a person who is basically from history. I got some difficulties with your reasoning. One, of course, is related to marginality, which I take it as originally emanating from structural and systems theories earlier and now part of post-structural theory, as you yourself are pointing out. And my feeling is that the whole question of marginality somehow is not connected with your concept of the state. So somehow it is because, as you yourself are just pointing out, you see, when, for example, spatial forms are developing, the state mediates it, which also means that, particularly in the I call it post-independence because I don't think that colonialism as such has not completely disappeared from us. So I used the term independent rather than post-colonial. Therefore, I call it as actually a point of nation-state formation. And the nation-state formation actually resulted in the incorporation of tribal spaces into what you call as marginal spaces. So if that is correct, then naturally one has to look into the ways and means by which this particular tribal spaces were actually confirmed and transferred into, what you call as marginal spaces and during the period after independence. That is one. Which also means that the state narrative, as you said, about the Adivasis state is not just an abstraction. It is also a congery of intellectuals who have been contributing to the state and making their ideologies possible, which also means there is a dominant theoretical form which exists in among us, which treats Adivasis in the same form. I think it should have been actually discussed. Actually, it should have been discussed because that is where the whole contradiction as well as the debate actually comes in. How do we look at Adivasis? How do we project Adivasis? And that projection becomes very important. It's not only a question of state as such, but the dominant hegemonic ideological form which makes that state projection possible. So that is, I think, an important thing, which is not just reduced to state and its legal forms. It is also a question of ideological forms also. So that has to be discussed in another way. Third thing is that, interestingly, you pointed out to the counterculture created by AGMS. But the problem with that counterculture is that, you talked also about the cultural features, etc. Identities and all that. But the problem which comes up is that the entire argument which you pointed out as belonging to Gidanandan, to which Janu disagreed, and I think correctly also to a certain extent, Gidanandan's argument basically followed the state discourse and the way in which, for example, the entire question of Adivasis has to be projected as a legal entity. That is where the question of you see, marginality is being transformed into legal entity. And this legal entity takes the place of, for example, 5 acres of land, 5th schedule of the Constitution, everything, part of the, what you call as a state discourse. So therefore, the state discourse was partially or fully accepted by the Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, and this acceptance probably might have resulted in their difficulties which they face later. And Janu herself pointed out the necessity of aligning herself with some political party, which is again a part of constitutional form. So therefore, that is another important thing. Third important thing, which I think is that your question of counterculture, did AGMS or any of the organizations so far, have they been able to, develop a protective alternative productive alternative to the existing state discourses. That is something which you have to look into. The 5 acres of land, the type of education process, the type of health process, etc., everything. Now, have they been, if, for example, which means that you have got to, you talked about capitalist modernity, again, a term which I do not agree with very much. I accept the word capitalism from my own positions. But anyway, but despite all these things, what happens is that you have got a problem there where the AGMS is unable to develop really an alternative to capitalist modernity from the point of view of the Adivasis, trying to actually put forward an alternate platform, either in the form of mobilization of resources, or in the form of education structure, or in the form of actually utilizing the land which they got. Again, has to be, that alternative should have been put forward. That alternative, I don't know, because I'm not very clear about that point, whether that alternative was actually put forward. Then finally, the question about forest land, which you're talking about. Now, who gave the slogan that Adivasis were forest dwellers? It is from the colonial period. Historically, it is from the colonial period that we give the narrative that Adivasis are forest dwellers. Instead, even earlier, the documents which I am familiar with as a student of history, Adivasis are simply people who are actually following a different form of productive as well as foraging activity, a kind of subsistence activity. It's different from others. That is about all. A lot of people are living in forests, a lot of people are living in the plainlands, and the Adivasis are simply among them. The term Adivasi, along with the narrative that Adivasi is a forest dweller, is very much a colonial creation, which means that it is a creation of the capitalist modernity, which has been accepted. Why don't we look at it from that point of view also? And finally, one more thing, which is, I think, very crucial, is that, see, do we call Adivasi as an identity? Or all the Adivasi belong to a particular identity? Or are they sets of people who follow different occupations, who dwell in different spaces, who actually are marginalized according to, who actually are being eliminated completely from the present developmental patterns. And this elimination is something which you call as marginality. That is what one has to look into. Why exactly they are being eliminated? So the entire question about a sociology of Adivasis will have to start from the point of view of their being eliminated. Why they are being eliminated? Because in Wayanad, why is it that the foraging population of Adivasis, the Kurichas, are not foraging? They are agricultural. Adiyas were foraging. Now, Adiyas and Kurichas did not belong to the same pattern at all. But both of them, Kurichas sort of survived and Adiyas did not, and both of them are eliminated by the process of actually occupation of that area, what they call as Vandavasis. And that occupation of the area, starting from colonialism, which continued until the recent migrations also. So that relationship will have to be looked into when we actually look into the whole problem of Adivasis. That is what I feel. So it's not a question of state alone. State comes into existence because they sponsored this migration. So also, why did they sponsor? It's another question. So all these things will have to be looked into before we get to do a discussion of marginality or multi-marginality, etc., etc. Please, thank you very much.
Yeah, so shall I respond?
Yeah, I finished.
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
Okay. So, I mean, I would like to begin from, see, the first thing which Ganesh Mash was talking about, that is the about the nation state formation and how the nation state formation in fact affected the community, or how the nation state formation, in fact, looking at the Adivasi community, or what was exactly, see this question, we explored this question a couple of times, where what was exactly the developmental imagination of the state, and how that developmental imagination that affected various sections of the people, especially, one section definitely is the Adivasi communities in India, where a lot of times this discussion happened, that is, what was the Nehruvian idea when we start the discussion from, after independence. I don't have much disagreement on the first point, that is, see, when the, that I mentioned, that is where I started, right? The state intervention in the domain of Adivasis communities, especially, post-colonial, definitely, I use the word post-colonial. Ganesh Mash was talking about post-independence. That is two different positions, right? Right. So that is talking about the Nehruvian developmentalism, which I don't have much disagreement. That is how Nehruvian developmentalism, in fact, looking at the Adivasi question, and what was exactly the way in which they were trying to assimilate Adivasi as part of the mainstream of the society. What was the tension involving in that process? What was actually the aspiration of the community that was very different from what we, and these discussions are there. But when it comes to the Gitanandan's position, where if we try to reduce that position merely as looking at the question as a legal entity, probably I won't agree so much with that position, right? Because that is actually, if we are, of course, 5 acres of land is one thing, and the constitutional protection is another thing, but that is not merely the movement, right? If you look at the different discourses of the movement, where definitely he played an important role in creating that discourses, where it was not merely an attempt to look at the question from the vantage point of legal entity, right? So that I hope that I presented in the paper, that is, what are the other aspects through which, the meaning of land as part of Adivasi life, right? How that is related to the social, economic, and cultural life of Adivasis, which is not true. I would say it is not true if we are merely reducing the entire thing into a legal entity, right? So that is where, how do we look at Adivasi question? See, how do we look at Adivasi question? So my effort was looking at the Adivasi question through the discourses of the movement. Of course, I was not part of the movement. I was not engaging with the movement. This is something which I methodologically would like to point out. But I was keeping a distance. Distance in the sense that is, I was keeping a distance as a researcher and trying to understand, right, what is exactly the meaning of these discourses constructed in the context of the movement. So that is why, see, when we ask this question, that is, whether this movement could produce any sort of alternative, right? I would say that, to see, interrogating marginality, which is definitely a very, very important aspect as far as the political history of Kerala is concerned, right? I don't think that, see, if you look at any Adivasi assertions in Kerala, prior to Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, and of course, post I won't say post Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, but the post is also making some sense because the movement is not active at the moment, right? But when you look at the mobilization and assertion of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, definitely one could say that is this engagement of interrogating marginality, and interrogating marginality definitely is an important effort of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha. A productive alternative in the sense that, see, right? I mean, there are various discussions that happened in the public domain of our society, whether, Adivasis, whether Adivasi communities should have, by accepting the heterogeneity of the community, that was the point which you are rightly pointed out. That is, when you look at the heterogeneity of the community, I completely agree with the community is not, when different sections of the people within the community definitely is not on the same page, right? But that productive community, what is exactly the productive alternative? There are various discussions that initiated by the movement, I would say. See, for instance, whether some kind of a relative autonomy, whether that relative autonomy should be given to the communities to manage a lot of things in relation to the life of the people, right? Where, how do you look at the modern legal framework and the framework of the community, probably by having a reciprocal understanding between these two things, which I'm not saying that is actually a concrete alternative that came up through the engagement of the movement. But I would say that definitely certain important discussions that the movement initiated, but that I mean they could not continue, and I think one of the reasons that, see, they could not continue because of is that, see, none of the mainstream political parties are interested to have a serious engagement with the whatever the limited alternative that they are suggesting, right? So this is, I would say, this is also one of the reasons, right? I mean, we are not in a position to have that kind of a discussion in the public domain of the society, right? So now, why they are being eliminated? Of course, I mean, that I mentioned in the paper, that is, I could not go to much of the history because I largely focused in the context of contemporary. Doesn't mean that the history was largely absent in the paper. No, I mean, there are history which I discussed in the paper, right? So the process of this elimination, where definitely, I mean, when you go back to the colonial, then post-colonial period, where that is the position which I am taking. That is right. State definitely is playing a very, very important role. But I would say that the state as some sort of a mundane positions in which there are various powerful communities associated with the state or connected to the state also played a very, very important role. So I mean, say, when I say state, I'm not merely looking at state as something which is a concrete institution that is located at the center. But what I'm saying is that, see, there are local manifestations of the state which is having a close association with the class relations of the society, which definitely played an important role in the marginalization or marginality of the Adivasis. That is where I thought that, right, we need to bring state in the center of the discussion, because state society relation, which is so important, where the when I use the word state, I'm not saying that it's merely some sort of a centralized authority, but it is also the local manifestations of the state, which is aligning with the class interest of various communities, of course, played a very, very important role in the marginality of Adivasis, right?
I got only one small thing to add to this. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
That small thing is that, at one time, the AGBMS came very close to, although they did not fully approve of it, to form an autonomous tribal council in areas which is actually which are actually in the regions of Wayanad as well as other parts. For example, Attapadi and some parts of Idukki also. And now this Kushner Tribal Autonomous Council was something that had been discussed and developed during the 1950s, primarily because during the Nehruvian era, when, for example, many of the northeastern tribals were actually being assimilated, you know about the type of protests that were taking place, Nagas actually going away, and we have got Manipuris also going away at one time. And during that time, this whole question of tribal council was being put forward, and which never was accepted. Although some tribal councils were formed here and there, but there was nothing concrete that developed. But AGMS came very close to it, but they never sort of finally clinched that position. And regarding the question of support by the political parties, etc., if, for example, such an alternative had been put forward, there would have been a possibility that one could have intervened in the entire political process and transformed the entire issue altogether. But that never took place. That is why I'm saying that this inability was one of the reasons why the AGM was unable to move forward. That's what I'm saying. That is the whole question of alternative which I was trying to put forward. I'm not saying that tribal welfare, but autonomous councils are the final, final solution to the Adivasi issue. Not at all. But the point is that there was an element by which the Adivasis could have really moved forward. That's what I believe. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but there was the possibility.
Another question by Susan Harris. She says that the speaker argued that AGMS argued for a modern place in contemporary society and thereby challenged their spatial and cultural marginality. But she's thinking about the resistance of an environmental group like WPSS to their occupation, and in that context, is not the occupation of the forest ideological and reproducing the central ideology and relation to the land. So, in the way, the marginality is replaced with an aspiration towards centrality that is not really a new imagination of the land.
I'm reading the question. I did not get it completely. So you argued that AGMS argued for a modern place in contemporary society. See, that is not exactly my argument. My argument is that, right, it is not about arguing a modern place in contemporary society. What is exactly the way in which a distinct modern understanding that they are developing as part of their movement discourse? That is the point, in fact, I made as part of the presentation. So, thereby challenge their spatial and cultural marginality. So, I'm thinking about the resistance of an environmental group like WPSS to their occupation. And in that context, is not the occupation of the forest. Occupation of the forest is not the occupation of the forest ideological. And reproducing the central ideology and relation to the land. See, the question which I'm getting, that is the occupation of the forest ideological. I mean, that is actually the position taken by the environmental groups, right? I mean, you know that, see, the environmental groups who were working specifically in Wayanad district, right, after the Muttanga incident, the position which they took, that was extremely problematic. Right, you know that, I mean, they are looking at a forest as well as environment, which is completely some sort of an exclusive entity where, I mean, people are no longer connected to that exclusive entity of forest and environmental. See, that is not the idea which AGMS is talking about. I mean, going beyond that, if you look at a political ecology framework, see, forest, we are not looking at, I mean, of course, I am not looking at forest as well as environment from an exclusive environmental framework. Rather, my framework is more closer to, I mean, a political ecology framework. And I found that is exactly the framework, I mean, to a greater extent, Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha is also talking about, right? Then and reproducing the central ideology. And reproducing the central ideology in relation to the land. So in this way, marginality is replaced with an aspiration towards centrality. That is not really a new imagination of the land. See, again, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is whether it is a problem of my articulation. See, this is not merely the question of center and periphery or center and margin. I mean, in a very conventional way, right? Rather, see, the way we constructed margin through our various discourses were, I mean, largely problematized through the discourses of AGMS. That is the point which I made, right? It doesn't mean that is they wanted to be part of the sender, which is not exactly the point we made, right? Rather than being part of this mainstream as well as the sender, see, they are trying to construct a new idea, this is what I mean, Ganesh was talking about whether there was an alternative, which is, I mean, was there any alternative proposed by Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha? I mean, what they attempted as part of the movement activism was constructing a different imagination about Adivasi life in a distinctive modern context. That is the point which I made, and that is actually emanating through the discourses of the movement. Right, rather than talking about sender as well as margin in a very I mean traditional as well as conventional way. So that's why we are saying that is when you are interrogating marginality, you're actually interrogating this particular kind of a relationship, right, between the sender and the margin that was constructed through various discourses.
Finally, one more question. Some Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha leaders politically made good relationships with the Vanavasi concepts of Hindutva, and they jointly contested in electoral politics in Wayanad. How can we analyze it?
See, of course, I mean, see, that is the recent turn of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha. I mean, that again, I would say that is we actually need to look at it very carefully, right? I mean, a lot of people are immediately jumping on this argument and saying that is, yeah, I mean, Janu became a propagator of Hindutva ideology, which I don't think, but I'm not denying that is that affiliation was there, that association was there, but we need to have a better understanding about that affiliation as well as right. This association, right? Rather than I mean going for a very black and white understanding, saying that is right. I mean, Janu completely changed her position and now being part of BJP, and I mean by affiliating with BJP and propagating the idea of Hindutva. Which I'm a little skeptical about that kind of a very plain argument, where I think that, I mean, I need to have, definitely I wanted to go for a more detailed fieldwork around these ideas, right, before I wanted to make certain conclusive arguments related to this, right. I mean, that is my idea. That is, see, we need to actually go for a detailed inquiry about the circumstances and the context in which certain decisions were made by the leaders of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha. So, I mean, that is my. Of course, see, this electoral politics, which I already mentioned that in the thing. See, because see, Janu was making an interesting point. That is, see, how long Adivasis can continue their fight, right? Or would you think that, I mean, Adivasis should always fight on an everyday basis to get certain, certain power, certain important measures, certain resources in the society, right? That point I found it very interesting. That's because, see, we are all, I mean, she was making an interesting point, that is, everyone is aspiring for a democratic life. Everyone is aspiring for a decent life. Everyone is aspiring for a life with dignity, right? Where if you are asking certain sections of the people to consistently fight for their rights, right? Would that be possible in the context of Adivasi life? I mean, that is actually a larger question which we need to unpack. That comment, I was actually, I mean, going back to that comment again and again and again. That is right, because we think that Adivasis are always meant for an everyday fight in the society, where I mean, a consistent struggle, consistent fight, I mean, continuous mobilization is the only way of living the life of an Adivasi, is the kind of an understanding that somewhere along the way we produce, right? So that is where I'm saying Janu was actually critically thinking about that, to see how do we change this kind of a situation, right? Whether there is a predominant electoral politics that is existing in the society. So if you are unable to engage with that kind of an electoral politics, probably, right, the aspiration that you are trying to build as part of the movement activism will not sustain after some time. I mean, I'm not, whether I would agree with that idea or not is a different question, but this is what she's actually, I mean, reflecting upon. So that's why, see, this question, I mean, that question is very, very important. And, but I don't have a very simplistic answer to say that it's no. I mean, after the saturation of Adivasi Gotra Mahasabha, Janu, I mean, took a completely different position, where now onwards she's actually propagating the idea of Hindutva, which is a very, very simplistic idea as far as mine is concerned, where I need to seriously reflect upon that.
Now we are towards the end of the program.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Dinesh, for chairing the session. Thank you, Professor K. Ganesh, for providing all kinds of support for our official performance. Thank you, Dr. Rajesh, for being part of our webinar. Thank you for the participants for actively taking part in the program. And finally, thank you for the entire KCHR team, especially Gautam Das, Sandhya, Abhidev, and Jishnu, for supporting me during the entire coordination of the event. An announcement regarding our next academic event. Our next public lecture is scheduled to be held on 6th January in connection with Elamkulam Kunyampilla Memorial Lecture by Dr. Manu Devadevan, Associate Professor of History, IIT Mandi. The event is being organized in collaboration with the Department of History, Kerala University. C.V. Raman Hall, Kairivatan campus will be the venue, and the time will be 10:30 a.m. The event will be live streamed. All are invited. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rajesh.